They actually called me obsessed. Can you believe that? Obsessed with a little stream of water that had danced through my backyard for way longer than any of us had been alive. Now, as their fancy houses built on showing off and shaky ground do, a slow, painful bow into the very hole their own smart ideas made, I find myself thinking about what being obsessed really means. If you've ever found yourself staring down a HOA's huge ego, wondering if you need to be crazy to have power, then you're in the right place. Get comfortable because you haven't heard anything like this story, and be sure to drop a comment below about your own fights with the neighborhood rule makers. My house, you see, was one of the older ones. It got to stay the way it was before. The big Willow Creek Estates HOA grew up like a really annoying type of mushroom. My land backed up to what used to be just empty land and a pretty little year-round creek. Willow Creek Minor, if you want to get fancy, wound across the bottom, part of my garden. It wasn't much, maybe 3 feet wide in most places, but it was alive. It kept up a tiny world of ferns, moss, thirsty willow trees, which the fancy neighborhood probably stole their name from, and a bunch of frogs that sang me to sleep on summer nights. I'd spent years taking care of its sides, pulling bad weeds by hand, and making sure its gentle flow wasn't blocked by sticks and leaves. It was in many ways the heart of my little piece of earth, a quiet example of nature's simple art. Then came Brenda. Brenda Sturgis, the new president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. A woman whose main skill for being a leader seemed to be having way too much self-importance and a voice that could sour milk from 50 feet away. She lived in one of the newer show-off houses on the other side of what used to be a peaceful field, now a tightly packed grid of matching beige houses with sadly small lawns. My first real meeting with Brenda happened on a Saturday morning. I was out working on some flowers near the creek when I saw her walking across my lawn like she owned it, with a nervous-looking man I later learned was Gary, the HOA secretary. She was wearing, and I'm not kidding, a bright pink ribbon across her chest that said, HOA President Getting Things Done, which looked totally ridiculous over her golf clothes. Mr. Henderson, I think, she started without saying hello first, her voice echoing a little in the morning air. I said yes, I was Mr. Henderson. We, the board of Willow Creek Estates, she announced, waving vaguely behind her like the whole beige neighborhood was her personal kingdom, have decided that your ditch, she said the word ditch with a particular sneer, is a big ugly problem and could cause drainage trouble for the community. I remember blinking, looking from her to my beloved creek, then back to her. This ditch, Mrs. President, I replied, keeping my voice calm, is Willow Creek Minor. It's been here for a very long time, and it's a natural water path. Brenda waved a dismissive hand, a gesture I would come to know and hate. Details, Mr. Henderson. It's ugly, it probably makes mosquitoes, and frankly, it's making the neighborhood look bad. We have plans for a better water feature for the community, something matching and nice looking. Your little trickle doesn't fit our master plan. I tried to reason with her, explaining what the creek did for nature, how it helped manage storm. Water naturally, the fact it was on my land, and that my house papers clearly showed it was there and I had rights to it. Gary looked more and more uncomfortable, fidgeting with his clipboard, but Brenda wouldn't budge, like a monument to unearned certainty. Oh, guidelines beat dusty old house papers, Mr. Henderson, she announced, like she was saying something really smart about the law. We expect you to help us fix this problem. We'll send you an official notice about the changes you need to make, or better yet, let us do the beautifying. I remember asking her what changes she had in mind for a natural creek, and she smiled, a thin, snake-like curve of her lips. Oh, something with pipes, maybe. Some nice rock fill. We need to control the water, you see. Water belongs to the community, not to people hoarding it in their backyards. That was the first hint I had that I wasn't dealing with a reasonable person, but with a way of thinking, an idea of petty control pretending to be community improvement. My old neighbor, Mr. Fitzwilliam, a retired surveyor who'd lived in his house since before I was born, had warned me about the new HOA board. Bunch of busybodies with too much time on their hands and a sudden taste of power, he'd grumbled over the fence one day. Think they're running a small country, not a bunch of overpriced houses. His words were proving right. That first fight set the stage for everything that came after. It was clear Brenda saw my creek not as something good, but as an insult to her vision of a perfectly groomed, completely lifeless suburban landscape, and she was determined to bring it and me under control. The official notice arrived a week later, a masterpiece of fancy jargon and hidden threats. It demanded I stop allowing unmanaged water flow and submit a fix-it plan within 30 days to blend the aforementioned drainage problem with the community's approved water prettiness. It was frankly crazy. My friend Sarah, a legal assistant, nearly choked on her coffee when I showed it to her. "This is gold, Alex," she'd said. "Pure HOA crazy. They can't just demand you destroy a natural water path on your own land because it offends their water prettiness." What even is that? She told me to write a polite but firm response citing my property rights, local and state environmental protections for waterways, however small, and to ask for a formal meeting with the full board complete with meeting notes. This, I learned, was step 1 in building a defense against bureaucratic overreach: create a paper trail. The polite but firm response, carefully written with Sarah's help and citing relevant county rules about natural waterways, was sent by certified mail. It stated quite clearly that Willow Creek Minor was an already existing natural feature of my property, protected by law, and that I would not be changing it, nor would I give the HOA permission to do so. I also formally asked for clarification on which specific HOA rule they believed gave them authority over a natural creek on private non-HOA property. The reply was not a clarification, but another, more aggressive letter from Brenda, copying the entire board. This one accused me of willful non-compliance and anti-community behavior. It hinted at fines and further actions to protect the interests and property values of Willow Creek Estates residents. The language was getting worse, and so was my determination. I began writing down everything. I took daily photographs of the creek, its flow, the plants around it. I set up a hidden trail camera supposedly to watch for wildlife, but also to record any unauthorized access to my property near the creek. I spent hours at the county records office looking through property maps, historical surveys, and water rights documentation. Mr. Fitzwilliam proved invaluable here, pointing me towards older records that clearly showed the creek's established path long before Willow Creek Estates was even a twinkle in a developer's eye. He even dug up an old land survey from the 1950s that marked it as a seasonal but important drainage path for the entire area. "See this, Alex?" he'd said, his weathered finger tracing a faint blue line on the yellowed paper. "This little fella carries a lot more water than people think, especially after a good spring melt or a heavy summer storm. They mess with that at their own risk." His words were both a comfort and a warning. The HOA, meanwhile, under Brenda's increasingly bossy direction, began their beautifying of the common areas next to my property line. This involved planting a row of identical non-native decorative shrubs right up to my fence, shrubs that needed an amazing amount of water and seemed determined to send their roots under my fence towards the moisture of my creek. Then came the first direct attack. I came home from work one afternoon to find a small, hastily built dirt wall about 10 feet long and a foot high pushed up against my fence line directly where the creek left my property and flowed into what was now HOA common land before disappearing into a larger city storm drain system further downstream. The wall was clearly designed to slow the flow, causing water to back up slightly onto my land. It wasn't a complete blockage, more of a petty, spiteful dam. I was furious. This was direct trespassing and an act of vandalism. The trail cam footage was crystal clear. 2 helpless HOA-hired landscapers under the bossy supervision of Brenda herself, complete with her pink sash and pointing finger, shoveling dirt and packing it down. I immediately called Sarah. "They've crossed a line, Alex. This is actual interference now," she said, her voice tight with professional anger. "We need to send a cease and desist for their actions, demanding removal of the wall and restoration of the natural flow, and put them on notice about damages." The letter was sent again by certified mail with copies of the incriminating photographs. Brenda's response, delivered verbally when she cornered me near my mailbox a few days later, was pure arrogance. "That little mud pile, Mr. Henderson. That's a temporary water diversion measure, part of our ongoing community enhancement. It's for the greater good. You should be thanking us for managing your runoff." I tried to explain once again the concept of property lines, natural water flow, and potential flood risk if the creek backed up significantly. She literally laughed. Flood risk from your pathetic little puddle? Don't be so dramatic. The HOA has expert engineers, Mr. Henderson. We know exactly what we're doing. This expert engineer claim became a recurring theme, though I never saw any evidence of one actually being consulted, certainly not for something as minor as her initial wall warfare. It was this breathtaking certainty, this utter refusal to consider any viewpoint but her own, that truly baffled me. It was as if the HOA's existence granted them all-knowing wisdom. The local newspaper even ran a small piece on community beautifying projects in the area, and there was Brenda quoted extensively talking about enhancing the natural landscape and implementing modern water management solutions for Willow Creek Estates. The irony was so thick you could have spread it on toast. The wall remained. The water, after a moderate rain, did indeed back up a little more, creating a soggier patch in my lower garden. I documented it all carefully. I also started talking to other neighbors, both those within the HOA and the few remaining independents like myself. While many HOA residents were scared of Brenda or simply didn't care, a few quietly expressed their own frustrations with her reign. Crazy fees for questionable enhancements, arbitrary enforcement of petty rules, and a general atmosphere of intimidation. It was becoming clear that my little creek was just one battlefront in Brenda's larger war for absolute control. The inside story started to filter through, tales of closed-door board meetings where disagreement was squashed and of HOA funds being channeled into Brenda's pet projects without proper oversight. The story of a simple dispute over a creek was expanding into something far more systematic. The real insanity, however, was yet to come. While Brenda continued her low-level fights against my creek, sending landscapers to trim plants on my side of the fence, they were chased off. And even once trying to get the city to declare my compost heap a public nuisance, it wasn't. The HOA board, under her unwavering guidance, embarked on a truly huge project. They decided they needed a signature water feature for Willow Creek Estates, not just a fountain, mind you, but something they grandly called the Willow Creek Cascades. A man-made series of ponds and connected channels that would run through a central common area, ending in a larger holding pond near the lowest point of the development. Not coincidentally, somewhat uphill from where my property sat, but on the opposite side of a small natural ridge that separated my land from the bulk of the HOA development. Their inspiration, as far as I could gather from the glossy brochures, they handed out featuring an artist's wildly optimistic picture of a veritable Venice Canal system, was to create a harmonious water loop that would be both pretty and environmentally responsible by recirculating water. The source of this water was a point of some internal HOA debate, or so Mr. Fitzwilliam heard through the grapevine. Some wanted to tap into the city water supply, others wanted to dig a well, but Brenda, in her infinite wisdom, apparently fixated on the idea of harvesting local runoff. She seemed to believe that all the water in the vicinity, including suspected the water in my creek, which she was still trying to control, was somehow community property. She's got this notion, Fitzwilliam chuckled one afternoon, that she can just dig a big ditch and all the rainwater in a 5-mile radius will politely line up to flow into it. He wasn't far off. The HOA hired a construction company, not a specialist water engineering firm, mind you, but a general earth-moving outfit that was more used to digging foundations and clearing lots. I watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as the bulldozers and excavators rolled in. They began carving a massive ditch, almost a small canyon, through the HOA common land. This wasn't a gentle stream, it was a deep, wide channel, with steep, unstable sides cut directly into the local clay soil, which I knew from my own gardening efforts became incredibly slick and mobile when saturated. They were, in effect, attempting to create an artificial river where nature never intended one to be, altering the existing drainage patterns of several acres of land. I started doing more research, this time into soil mechanics and water engineering. I even paid for a consultation with Dr. Evans, a retired university professor of geology who specialized in land formation and watercourse engineering. I showed him the HOA's plans, which I'd managed to get a copy of from a disgruntled HOA member, and photos of the ongoing excavation. Dr. Evans stroked his beard, a grim look on his face. "This is ambitious," he said, which I took to mean incredibly stupid. He pointed out several critical flaws. "They're cutting through layers of clay and sand here," he explained, tapping a geological map of the area, "without proper shoring, terracing, and vegetation to stabilize these slopes. Especially with the degree of inclination they're aiming for, you're asking for slumping and erosion on a significant scale. And this retention pond they're proposing at the bottom, have they calculated the actual watershed area they're now funneling into it? Clay soil doesn't absorb quickly. A heavy rain event could overwhelm this entire system spectacularly." He also noted the proximity of several houses to the new cascades. "The soil here is mostly fill from when they developed the estate," he mused, looking at the plans. "Changing the water table and saturation levels so close to foundations built on potentially uncompacted or poorly compacted fill. Well, it's not something I'd recommend without very thorough ground studies." I asked him half-jokingly if he'd be willing to write a letter to the HOA. He smiled. "Young man, I've written enough letters to foolish committees in my lifetime to know it's usually like shouting into the wind. But for a small fee, I can provide you with a professional assessment of their plans and the potential risks." I took him up on it. The resulting report was a damning indictment of the HOA's project, predicting significant erosion, potential slope failure, and a high risk of localized flooding if the system was subjected to heavy rainfall. It was polite, professional, and terrifying. Armed with this, I composed another letter to Brenda and the HOA board. I attached Dr. Evans's report, highlighted the key concerns, and respectfully urged them to halt construction and seek an independent ground review from a qualified firm. I wasn't even asking them to listen to me anymore. I was asking them to listen to an actual expert. The response, a curt, dismissive email from Gary, the secretary, presumably dictated by Brenda. "The Willow Creek Estates HOA appreciates your continued, albeit unsolicited, interest in our community enhancement projects. Please be assured that our contractors are highly experienced and all necessary precautions and engineering standards are being carefully followed. We consider this matter closed." No mention of Dr. Evans's report, no addressing of the specific risks, just a pat on the head and a run along now. It was like watching someone gleefully saw off the branch they were sitting on, all while assuring you they had a PhD in tree surgery. The digging continued. The fake river grew deeper, the piles of dug-up earth higher. They even started installing some large decorative boulders and a few rather flimsy-looking wooden bridges. Brenda was often on site, directing operations like a low-budget movie director, often with her ridiculous sash catching the breeze. She even had the audacity to tell a local community news blogger who was doing a fluff piece on neighborhood improvements that their innovative water management system was going to be a model for other communities and would finally solve the persistent drainage issues that have plagued parts of this area. A thinly veiled jab at my creek, still flowing unmolested on my property at least. The arrogance was sky high. The late summer was unusually dry, which perversely seemed to embolden the HOA. Their massive earthworks project, the Willow Creek cascades, took shape without any immediate dramatic failures, leading Brenda and her group to believe their genius was confirmed. They even held a small self-congratulatory groundbreaking ceremony for the final phase, the installation of a powerful pump for their ridiculous recirculation system, complete with cheap champagne and plastic glasses and a speech from Brenda about vision and community spirit overcoming skepticism. I, of course, was not invited, though I observed the proceedings with grim fascination from my fence line, the professionally bound copy of Dr. Evans's dire predictions feeling heavy in my hand. My little creek, meanwhile, continued its gentle journey, somewhat diminished by the dry spell and still partially blocked by Brenda's spite wall at my property line, but alive nonetheless. I continued to document everything. The slow but noticeable drying and cracking of the exposed clay slopes along the HOA's artificial riverbed, the way dust plumed from it with every gust of wind, the strained look on the faces of the construction crew who, I suspected, knew better than to argue with their employers, but also knew a poorly conceived project when they saw one. Mr. Fitzwilliam would often join me, shaking his head. That whole thing is an accident waiting to happen, son. Clay like that. When it finally gets wet after a long dry spell, it's going to move. And not in a good way. He was a man of few words, but his announcements usually carried the weight of long experience. As autumn approached, the weather patterns began to shift. The long, dry summer gave way to a series of early, unseasonably heavy rain showers. The kind of rain that the parched ground couldn't absorb. The kind that sheeted off surfaces and sought the lowest point with relentless efficiency. The first few showers were minor, but they offered a preview. The raw earth of the Cascades turned into a muddy slurry. Small streams of silt began to stain the brand-new decorative boulders Brenda was so proud of. The carefully sculpted banks showed early signs of erosion, little collapses and undercuttings. I saw HOA maintenance workers looking rather miserable out with shovels, trying to patch up the worst of it, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a teaspoon. Brenda naturally dismissed these initial signs. I overheard her telling a worried-looking resident near the project that it was just settling and perfectly normal for a new installation. She even had the gall to imply that the muddy runoff was somehow made worse by uncontrolled water sources nearby. Another clear dig at my creek, which, ironically, was actually handling the increased rainfall quite well, its established vegetation, and natural curves slowing and filtering the water as nature intended. The contrast was becoming stark. My small, unsightly creek was a model of resilience, while their multi-thousand-dollar engineered marvel was already looking like a problem child. Then the weather forecasters started talking about a major system moving in, a pineapple express, they called it. A plume of deep tropical moisture set to stall over our region for several days, promising sustained heavy rainfall. This wasn't just a shower, this was a deluge in the making. I checked my own property's drainage, cleared the culvert under my driveway, and made sure the banks of Willow Creek Minor were free of any loose debris that could cause a jam. I even, with a heavy heart, and after consulting Sarah about potential liability, if I didn't try to reduce something on their side that was clearly affecting me, took a shovel and carefully, discreetly, removed a small section of Brenda's wall at my property line. Just enough to allow my creek to flow more freely if the water levels rose significantly. I photographed my actions, of course. Better to be accused of minor, well-documented tampering for safety reasons than to have my property flood because of their obstruction. Dr. Evans's report lay on my desk, its warnings echoing in my mind. Clay soil doesn't absorb quickly. A heavy rain event could overwhelm this entire system spectacularly, changing the water table and saturation levels so close to foundations built on potentially uncompacted or poorly compacted fill. I looked out at the pristine lawns and imposing facades of the Willow Creek Estates homes, particularly those built closest to the precipice of Brenda's folly, and felt a cold knot of worry. The HOA, however, seemed oblivious. They put up a few token silt fences around the Cascades, the kind of flimsy barriers that might stop a rogue garden hose, but would be utterly useless against a serious flow of water. Brenda was quoted in another brief online community update as saying, "Willow Creek Estates is fully prepared for the anticipated weather. Our state-of-the-art water features are designed to handle all eventualities." The sheer, pure hubris was breathtaking. The air grew heavy, the skies turned a bruised purple-gray, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. It was the overture to a symphony of destruction, and Brenda was about to conduct its grand, chaotic finale, whether she knew it or not. The rain started in earnest on a Friday evening, a relentless drumming downpour that showed no signs of letting up all night. It hammered against the roof, a constant, oppressive roar. By Saturday morning, my little Willow Creek Minor was transformed. It was no longer a gentle ribbon, but a swift brown torrent, swollen to the very top of its banks, but still contained, still flowing purposefully along its ancient path, now thankfully unblocked at my property line where I'd made that small breach, in Brenda's wall. It was doing its job, draining the excess water from my land and the surrounding higher ground. The same could not be said for the HOA's grand folly, the Willow Creek Cascades. I ventured out in my rain gear, driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't suppress. The sight that greeted me from the edge of the HOA common land was astonishing. The massive, ill-conceived channel they had carved was now a raging river, a furious, muddy torrent far exceeding anything its designers, if there truly were any, qualified ones, could have envisioned. The decorative boulders were submerged or dislodged, tossed about like pebbles. The flimsy wooden bridges were either gone, swept away, or grotesquely twisted. The carefully sculpted clay banks were visibly collapsing, huge chunks of earth carving off and sliding into the churning water, widening the channel with every passing minute. The token silt fences were a distant memory, overwhelmed and buried, but the truly horrifying part was what was happening to the land around it, especially on the slope where several of the newer, larger HOA homes stood, their picture windows, looking out, or perhaps now down, onto the disaster. The ground was visibly saturated, water pooling everywhere. And then I saw it. A crack. A fresh, jagged fissure in the manicured lawn of the house closest to the chaos. A house belonging to one of Brenda's staunchest allies on the board. As I watched, transfixed by the terrible spectacle, the crack widened. Small streams of water were now pouring into it from the lawn. The earth itself seemed to be groaning. Then, with a sickening liquid sigh, a whole section of the terrace landscaping below that house began to slump, to liquefy and slide downward toward the raging artificial river. It was like watching a sand castle melt in slow motion. Only this was thousands of tons of earth, and it was taking pristine lawns, expensive shrubs, and concrete patios with it. I heard a shout and saw a figure emerge from the house, gesticulating wildly. It was the homeowner, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Other residents were appearing now, drawn by the noise and the sheer escalating chaos. And then I saw Brenda. She was standing near the edge of the rapidly eroding bank, her ridiculous HOA president's sash now soaked and clinging to her, looking utterly pathetic. She was yelling, pointing, seemingly trying to direct a couple of bewildered-looking HOA maintenance guys who were standing by helplessly, their shovels utterly inadequate for the scale of the unfolding catastrophe. Her usual air of imperious command had been replaced by a dawning, frantic panic. The rain kept falling, relentless and unforgiving. I pulled out my phone, its screen streaked with rain, and began to record. Not out of malice, exactly, though a certain grim satisfaction was undeniably present, but for the record, for the inevitable inquiries, for the insurance adjusters, for posterity. This was the direct, undeniable consequence of hubris, incompetence, and a refusal to listen to reason or expert advice. The smoking gun wasn't a document this time. It was the earth itself, surrendering to the laws of physics and gravity that Brenda and her board had so blindly ignored. Another section of land gave way closer to a different house. This time, a corner of a concrete driveway cracked and tilted at a crazy angle. A collective gasp went up from the small crowd of onlookers. The man-made river was no longer just a spectacle. It was actively eating away at the foundations of their community, quite literally. The emergency sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer. Someone had clearly called for help. But what could they do? You can't undig a river in the middle of a torrential downpour. You can't unsaturate tons of unstable clay soil. All the warnings, all the ignored advice, all the dismissed concerns, Dr. Evans's report, my letters, Mr. Fitzwilliam's quiet pronouncements, were now manifesting as a terrifying, undeniable reality. The show wasn't a confrontation with me. It was a confrontation with the inexorable forces they had unleashed. Their Grand Cascades project, designed to be a monument to their vision, had become a monument to their folly, a gaping maw devouring their own pristine properties. The water, which Brenda had been so determined to control and manage, was now demonstrating with devastating clarity who was truly in charge. The arrival of the fire department and emergency crews added a new layer of frantic activity to the scene, but even they seemed overwhelmed by the scale of what was happening. Their immediate concern was public safety, and soon evacuation orders were being issued for the homes most directly threatened by the collapsing land. I watched as families, their faces pale with shock, hurried from their houses, carrying pets and a few hastily gathered belongings. Brenda was in the thick of it, still wearing her soaked sash, trying to assert some authority, but her voice was lost in the roar of the water and the general panic. I saw her accost a fire captain, pointing animatedly toward the collapsing slope, then toward my property, as if somehow my little, well-behaved creek was to blame for this self-inflicted cataclysm. The captain, a man clearly burdened with more pressing concerns, just shook his head and moved on, directing his crew to cordon off the expanding danger zone. The rain finally began to ease by late afternoon, but the damage was done. The Willow Creek Cascades was no longer a channel, it was a ragged, gaping canyon. The houses closest to it were in a dangerous state. One, the home of Brenda's board ally, had a significant portion of its backyard simply gone, sheared away as if by a giant invisible knife, leaving the foundation exposed and a patio dangling precariously over the muddy abyss. Another had a large diagonal crack running up its side, a visible testament to the shifting earth beneath it. Utility crews were struggling to shut off gas and electricity to the affected properties, fearing further disasters. The sheer destructive power that had been unleashed was sobering. My own property, by contrast, was remarkably unscathed. Willow Creek Minor was still running high and fast, but it stayed within its banks, its course clear, its ecological integrity intact, doing exactly what it was supposed to do: channel excess water safely away. The small adjustment I'd made to Brenda's wall had proven crucial, allowing the creek to breathe and preventing any significant backup onto my land. It was a stark, silent vindication. Over the next few days, as the water levels in the HOA's disaster zone slowly receded, the true extent of the devastation became horribly clear. Geotechnical engineers, real ones this time, were crawling all over the site, their faces grim. Surveyors were taking measurements. Insurance adjusters, looking harassed and overwhelmed, were navigating the muddy landscape, clipboards in hand. Several homes were immediately red-tagged, declared unsafe for occupation. The price tag for the HOA's beautification project was rapidly escalating from thousands to potentially millions in damages, emergency stabilization efforts, and inevitable lawsuits. The smoking gun was everywhere, in the design plans that Dr. Evans had critiqued in my documented warnings, in the very earth that had rebelled against their ill-conceived interference. My meticulously kept records, including Dr. Evans's report and my correspondence with the HOA, suddenly became items of great interest, not to Brenda, who I heard was now desperately trying to shift blame onto the contractors, the weather, or sunspots, but to the increasingly angry and litigious residents whose homes were damaged or threatened. Sarah, my legal assistant friend, advised me to cooperate with any official investigations but to be cautious. "You're in the clear, Alex," she said. "In fact, you're more than clear. You're the guy who tried to warn them. But don't get drawn into their internal blame game. Just stick to the facts. Provide your documentation if formally requested by authorities or through legal channels, and let them sort out their own mess." Mr. Fitzwilliam, observing the circus from his own safe vantage point, just shook his head. "Never underestimate the destructive power of ignorance combined with authority," he mused, "especially when they start messing with dirt and water." His simple wisdom summed it up perfectly. The fallout for Brenda was swift and brutal. An emergency HOA meeting was called, held not in their usual clubhouse, which was uncomfortably close to the unstable zone, but in a rented community hall. From what I heard from sympathetic ears still within the HOA, it was a verbal bloodbath. Accusations flew. Residents who had lost the most were furious with rage, and Brenda's attempts to deflect blame were met with derision and fury. Her reign as the water warden of Willow Creek Estates came to an embarrassing end. She, along with most of her board, resigned under immense pressure. The remaining members, shell-shocked and facing a mountain of liabilities, were left to pick up the pieces. The irony was not lost on me. Their grand project to control and redirect water, conceived partly out of spite for my little creek and a desire to assert dominance, had resulted in a catastrophic loss of control directly caused by water, amplified by their own engineering incompetence. My creek, the one they had dismissed as an unsightly ditch and a pathetic little puddle, flowed on, a quiet symbol of nature's enduring logic and resilience in the face of human arrogance. The aftermath was a long, drawn-out affair. The Willow Creek Estates HOA was plunged into a financial and legal maelstrom. Special assessments were levied on all homeowners to cover the astronomical costs of emergency slope stabilization, debris removal, and the initial rounds of legal fees. Several of the most damaged homes were eventually declared uninhabitable and had to be either extensively repaired at crippling cost or, in 1 or 2 cases, demolished. The Grand Willow Creek Cascades project was, of course, abandoned, its half-finished, now ravaged remnants serving as a monument to epic mismanagement. The deep gash they had carved in the earth was partially filled and regraded at enormous expense to try and reduce further erosion, but it would never look like the pristine common area it once was. It remained a scar on the landscape and on the HOA's reputation. Brenda Sturgis, stripped of her pink sash and her petty authority, faded into humiliated obscurity. I heard she sold her house at a significant loss, given the geotechnical cloud now hanging over that part of the development, and moved away. Good riddance. Gary, her erstwhile secretary, and the other board members who had enabled her folly faced their own share of the community's wrath and the financial repercussions. Lawsuits abounded, homeowners suing the HOA suing the original contractors, who in turn pointed to the vague and inadequate specifications they were given by the HOA, and insurance companies trying to limit their payouts. My documentation, including Dr. Evans's prescient report, was indeed subpoenaed for several of these legal proceedings. It laid out in cold, hard facts that the disaster was not an act of God, as some initially tried to claim, but a foreseeable consequence of willful negligence and amateur engineering. I simply provided the information as requested,